Okay, well, Peter, one of the things that we have this opportunity being here at the CIM, the Centro Internacional Miranda, to talk about a lot of questions, you know, the whole issue of the Bolivarian Revolution, medical pedagogy, Marxism, et cetera, like that, and it's a good opportunity to explore these questions. And one of the most interesting questions, it seems to me, you know, when people look at Venezuela, is some of the unique characteristics of the Bolivarian Constitution. This whole emphasis on the full development of human potential, that everyone should have the opportunity to develop their potential, their full personality, and also the recognition that this can only occur through practice, through participation. It's a necessary condition. And one of the things that strikes me from the little I know about, you know, your work in radical pedagogy, that seems to me that this is exactly the same kind of focus. I don't know whether you want to explore that.
Well, it is. I mean, it's certainly the aspects of the Constitution here in Venezuela that we mentioned are remarkable in the sense that they reflect a Deweyan, Freirean approach to learning through self-activity. And of course, in addition to the stress on human development and capacity building and self-organization and in self-realization, creativity, capacity building, etc. There's obviously a revolutionary trajectory here, which in history, and which sort of adds to the whole exercise of what it means to become a critical agent for self and social transformation. So to me, the interesting and important aspect of the Bolivarian Constitution is its emphasis on self and social empowerment. So you can't have self-empowerment without social empowerment. You can't have social empowerment without self-empowerment. So there's I think, an intrinsic dialectic in it, which is absolutely worth exploring, and I think necessary for people to examine and use as an example for constitution building everywhere.
Well, the Constitution, from what I can see, was like a snapshot at the moment of that, of the process, because it contained these elements which I see as enormously subversive of capitalist society. But at the same time, it focused on the private sector being maintained, the bank having central bank having independence. So it reflected. It was sort of caught between capitalism and the undermining of capitalism. But when you look at that part of the undermining of capitalism, it seems really incompatible to have. If the Constitution really means something, and so many constitutions don't mean anything, then it has to involve the creation of institutions which empower people.
That's right. No, I mean, there is a self-contradictory aspect to it, of course, and I think that to me is where critical pedagogy comes in. I mean, that to me is something that can address the unlocking of this potential for revolutionary ends, and that requires pedagogical approach to the Constitution to unleash revolutionary potential in a document which, in some levels, appears to be to contain a fundamental contradiction. So that, to me, is a challenge of a pedagogical approach to the question of the Constitution and how to build from the Constitution as the Bolivarian Revolution proceeds apace.
Well, that raises two questions in my mind. One is are these kinds of elements that you can see in the Constitution, are they, to your knowledge, being embodied in the educational process now here in Venezuela?
Well,
That's one question for you.
I wish I could answer that question more adequately. From what I've seen in the limited times that I've come here, and at the Bolivarian University, as one example, and in some of the misiones, the educational missions, as other examples, I would say that yes, that the education that's attempted to get some kind of traction and momentum does reflect fundamentally the question of capacity building, self-organization, self-activity, learning through doing, but beyond the doing sense of just learning through doing anything, but learning to engage in projects which build community, learning to engage in projects which speak to questions much larger than individual self-interest, learning to think collectively for the greater good of the social order. And that's something that's absolutely remarkable, what I've seen so far in my visits to the missions and the Bolivarian. I mean, I had a meeting with the rector today of the Bolivarian University with my compañero Natalia Jaramillo, who was with me speaking to some of the teachers, some of the teacher educators at the university. And the conversation we had with this rector about the mission of the Bolivarian University was I wish I had recorded it, because it was, it just contained the seedbed of all one could wish for when one thinks of the purpose of an institution, learning, reaching out into the communities, teachers working in spaces which may not, in fact, even have sufficient lighting, working in people's homes, taking the university, taking the professors, taking the classes to different parts of the country, and working in a way in which really reflects a lot of the best of what Paulo Freire's talking about. He's talking about cultural circles, starting with students' experiences, building with those experiences, and yet challenging the students to rethink those experiences and to revisit their own self-formation using some of the ideas that have been won from historical struggles in the present and in the past to really build a revolutionary society. And so I was sitting there thinking, where could we find an administrator, a president of a university that could, in the space of 15 minutes, convey that spirit to visitors.
I've seen, from the little I've seen at the Bolivarian University, I have the same exact sense,
Yeah.
although I think that, you probably appreciated the things that you were hearing much more than I, because it's not an area for me. But I wonder if this is unique. For example, if we look at the education at the lower levels,
Yeah.
I mean, certainly one of the things that's been clear is an enormous increase in inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
But has the structure of education changed?
Yeah.
And one of the things I know that some people have raised is the problem of teaching by video.
Yeah.
Because video, and I know this is a criticism that Canadian professors that I know have come about Cuba, have said about Cuban video teaching, which is, it's inherently this delivery of packaged knowledge. So is that possible? Is that consistent with radical pedagogy?
It's interesting. I've had the opportunity to see a number of classes using videos. But I haven't been able to really ascertain at this point, how those videos are always used, how they could be used. I think videos in and of themselves aren't necessarily incompatible with the radical pedagogy. Depends upon how those videos are used and whether they're the only medium of instruction. I use videos all the time, critically in my classes. So I haven't had a chance to really come to any kind of definitive, conclusion. But the larger question of if the videos in fact are simply used to transmit knowledge, and the question of knowledge is left, under-challenged, and not, without any kind of critical reflection, without any kind of dialogue about what they've learned. If there's no opportunities to question what they've seen and what they've heard, and to ask further questions and to make links to other contexts, then those videos could be, very standard form of cultural transmission that critical pedagogy is always critiqued. Again, it depends. In and of themselves, those videos aren't necessarily problematic. One can engage those videos in a very critical, self-focused way. I think there's a potential to do that. Whether that's being done or not, I have no idea. I tend to think that it's probably not done, simply because the teachers and instructors who are volunteers might not have a grounding in popular education, dialogical education, Freirean education, and they may not be aware of the dangers of simply transmitting knowledge, which is a Freire's concept of banking education.
Well, I mentioned I had two questions that link to the Constitution, and one of them sort of changing as you've been talking. The Constitution, with its focus on human development and human development only through practice, one of the questions that comes to mind is, it seems to me that the Constitution itself can be, in Venezuela, a major teaching device, because it raises these questions that people embrace and they see the importance of this in the Constitution, and so it means that it should be possible to introduce ideas of critical pedagogy here much more easily than in a society where those concepts have not been introduced. North America, for example, is a society where those concepts are foreign, and you could raise these questions by talking about Marx, and say, well, Marx talks about human development, and this is the central core of his argument, the whole issue of revolutionary practice, the simultaneous changing of circumstances and self-change. But of course, Marx is a hard sell in North America. But the question is, could the Bolivarian Constitution, with the things it's raising, could that be something that would facilitate these kinds of thoughts in North America?
Absolutely. One of the things that I noticed when I was visiting Mission Mercat, which is food collectors, is that on packages of sugar, packages of flour, packages of rice, they have excerpts from the Venezuelan Constitution. They have lines and phrases from the Venezuelan Constitution on those staple goods to remind people that this is a rich resource, and that the very food that they're able to eat in these collectives are inextricably linked to the values and practices that exist in the Constitution. And I found that a very interesting pedagogical device. As a matter of fact, what I did was I purchased a lot of food at the mission, and then repackaged them and gave the food away, but kept the packaging just because I wanted to show my students when I got back to the United States. But of course, in the United States, where I'm Canadian, but I have dual citizenship. But one of the interesting things about living in the United States since 1985 is my sense that human rights is something that people talk about, but they rarely ever link human rights to economic rights. Economic rights is seen as antithetical to democracy because they see it as giving something to somebody for nothing. In other words, handouts to lazy people who sit around and watch TV and eat cornflakes or whatever, or Twinkies or whatever. I mean, there's this real sense that economic rights are not really part of the broad umbrella of human rights, and I think that whereas in the Constitution, the Venezuelan Constitution, of course, I still have so much to learn about that Constitution. But my sense is that there's a fundamental opportunity to talk about human rights as economic rights and as the right to live up to your creative capacity and the importance of creating the cultural forms, the organizational, institutional forms that will enable that kind of creativity to flourish. And so it's really quite a dialectical process because talk about cultural forms, social structures, institutional formations, and human capacities. Certain kind of human capacities enable us to imagine what those kind of formations might look like, and those formations, by the same token, help us to create a very fecund, rich form of creative energies. And so, yeah, I think that the Constitution here is something that could serve as a major, discursive vehicle for our pedagogical efforts. Yeah, absolutely.
But that raises the question I wanted to get into, which is the issue of socialism.
Yeah.
Certainly, when we talk about the question of human development and how it requires, the full participation of people, or the ending, for example, of the division between thinking and doing.
Yes.
That hierarchical structure within society and within industry. Then a central aspect of that has to be a process of self-management within industry and self-government within societies, within communities, etc. We look at the history of socialism of the 20th century. These patterns are not things you find.
Yes.
To some extent, you could see it in Yugoslavia in the self-managed enterprises.
Yes.
But there were real limitations as to what was happening there. It was very much a process which was limited to the self-management within specific enterprises rather than a concept of looking at society as a whole. But the question is, don't we see then the incompatibility of some of these ideas about human development and through activity with some of the practices that occurred in the 20th century efforts at building socialism?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I was thinking here of you talked about Yugoslavia, but of course there's the well-known Caracas, right? Here, which was an interesting phenomenon here that you might want to talk about a little bit, because I'm sure you know more about that than I do. But you're right, so that you're right if what I understand you saying is that the attempts to create socialism in the past have contradicted Marx's understanding of the flourishing of human capacities and creative self-activity, right? From Luxemburg, so you're saying. So we need to learn what went wrong, where the incompatibilities were historically, right? And look for new specific ways here in Venezuela at this historical moment where we have the opportunity that might in fact be more faithful to that Marxist notion. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I see
Yeah.
that there, and certainly we go look at Marx, we
Yeah.
can see this thread that runs through him from his earliest writing about revolutionary practice to
Sure.
his discussion of the commune, and
Absolutely.
people are constantly, will have to go through 10, 20, 30
That's right.
years of 50 years
That's
of
right.
civil war, not only to change circumstances, but to change themselves,
Yeah.
to make themselves fit, for this new society. And you see that thread also in Rosa Luxemburg,
Yes.
and in her criticism of the structure of the vanguard party,
That's right.
when she talks about the working class demands the right to make its own mistakes and to learn from the dialectic of history. And you see it here, I think,
Yeah.
as well. And in Yugoslavia, I think there were some kinds of tendencies there. Certainly, one of the people who influenced me quite a bit was a Yugoslav philosopher, Gajo Petrovic, who talks about human beings as beings of praxis. And I noticed that Freire quotes him as well. I mean, it was very important, this whole emphasis on the being of praxis.
Yes.
That's so central.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I conceptually, it makes sense for me to think about it in philosophical terms. So, again, I say Marxist humanism. I like to think of critical pedagogy as developing the philosophy of praxis, a revolutionary philosophy of praxis. And I think that one of the insights I've certainly gleaned from my engagement with Marxist humanism and Marxist humanist theorizing and thinking and practice has been that the whole concept of absolute negativity, which is really grounded in Marx, which is not just mere negativity,